Clara embarks on an expedition through the wild jungles of South America, seeking adventure and freedom from her small-town life. Alongside Victor, a charismatic but haunted explorer, she faces nature's fiercest elements, including a perilous storm and a treacherous mountain pass. As their connection deepens and secrets unfold, Clara must confront her own fears and a sacrifice that could shatter her heart forever. What price will she pay to survive, and will love be enough to carry her through the storm? Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's dive in. Clara stood at the edge of the grand platform, watching the steam rise from the gleaming train that would soon carry her far from everything she had ever known. She had never seen anything like it. The polished brass, the dark wood finishes, and the staff in immaculate uniforms, attending to the well-dressed passengers, who seemed to glide effortlessly across the platform. Clara tightened her grip on her modest suitcase, feeling a pang of doubt. Was she truly meant to be here among such people? The prestigious expedition through the heart of South America had attracted adventurers, aristocrats, and wealthy socialites from across the world. But Clara wasn't like them. Raised in a quiet town, Clara had always dreamed of something bigger. Her days had been filled with mundane chores and modest ambitions, yet her heart had always longed for more. She wanted to experience the world beyond the narrow confines of her upbringing. This journey was supposed to be her escape, her chance to live the life she had always dreamed of, even if only for a few weeks. She had spent years saving up for the trip, and now that it was here, the reality of it all was overwhelming. She took a deep breath and boarded the train, walking past the first-class compartments with their velvet seats and crystal glasses, knowing full well that she would be seated at the back with the other travelers who didn't quite belong. The train lurched into motion, and as Clara found her seat, she gazed out of the window, watching the familiar landscape slip away. Her heart pounded with a mix of excitement and fear. Everything was changing, and she was about to embark on an adventure she had only ever dreamed of. The other passengers were a striking group. They filled the air with the hum of casual conversation about art exhibits, galas, and luxury hotels in places Clara had only read about in books. She overheard snippets of conversation in different languages, the tones and accents foreign to her ears. These were the elite, the privileged, who lived lives of ease and grandeur. And here she was, a young black woman from a small town, slipping quietly into a world she had never imagined she could be part of. For a moment, she considered retreating into her shell, withdrawing into the corner of her seat, and letting the journey pass in silence. But that wasn't why she had come. She had always been resilient, had always fought against the limitations placed on her by the world. And this journey, this adventure, was her chance to push past those boundaries, to prove to herself that she could be part of something grand, no matter what anyone else thought. The days that followed were a blur of new experiences and breathtaking sights. The train wound its way through dense jungles, over wide rivers, and through misty mountains, each new landscape more stunning than the last. Clara spent her days gazing out of the window, absorbing every detail, every color and texture of the world outside. She felt alive in a way she never had before, as though the beauty of the landscape was filling her with a sense of purpose she had never known. But as much as she tried to immerse herself in the adventure, there was an undercurrent of discomfort. Many of the other passengers treated her with indifference, or, worse, with thinly veiled disdain. They rarely spoke to her, and when they did, it was with an air of condescension that made her blood boil. They would ask her where she was from, but the answer never seemed to satisfy them. They would make assumptions about her, about what she could or couldn't afford, about why she was there in the first place. Still, Clara refused to let it deter her. She wasn't here for them. She was here for herself. One afternoon, while the group stopped at a remote jungle village, Clara wandered off on her own, drawn by the sounds of the distant waterfall. The dense foliage closed in around her as she made her way through the underbrush, the hum of insects filling the air. She reached the waterfall, its roar filling her ears, and stood transfixed by its power and beauty. It was the most magnificent thing she had ever seen, the cascading water catching the sunlight and creating rainbows in the mist. As she stood there, lost in the moment, she became aware of someone approaching. She turned to see a man standing a few feet away, watching her with an expression of quiet curiosity. He was tall and lean, with a rugged appearance that suggested he was no stranger to the wild. His clothes were practical but well worn, and there was a depth in his eyes that immediately captured her attention. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said, his voice low and calm. Clara nodded, unsure of what to say. She wasn't used to people striking up conversations with her, especially not someone like him. There was something different about this man, something that set him apart from the others in their group. He seemed comfortable in the wilderness, at ease in a way the other passengers never were. "I'm Victor," he said, extending his hand. "Clara," she replied, shaking his hand and feeling a strange sense of warmth spread through her at the touch. For a moment, they stood in silence, watching the waterfall together. Clara felt an unexpected sense of connection with Victor, though she couldn't quite explain why. Perhaps it was the way he seemed so at ease in the wild, or the way he looked at her without the judgment or pretense that she had grown used to. He didn't seem to care who she was or where she came from. He was simply there, present in the moment with her. "I've been on expeditions like this before," Victor said after a while. "But there's something about this place. It feels different." Clara glanced at him, curious. "Different how?" Victor hesitated, as if considering how much to reveal. "I can't quite explain it. It's like there's something waiting for us here, something we're not expecting." Clara's heart skipped a beat at his words. She had felt it too, a sense of anticipation building within her ever since the journey began, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Their conversation was cut short by the sound of the expedition leaders calling them back to the group. Victor smiled at her and gave a slight nod before turning to walk away. Clara watched him go, her mind racing. There was something about Victor, something that intrigued her and unsettled her at the same time. She had a feeling that their paths would cross again, and that when they did, it would change everything. As the sun set that evening, casting a golden glow over the jungle, Clara sat by the fire with the rest of the group. But her mind was elsewhere, thinking of the waterfall, of Victor, and of the strange sense of destiny that seemed to be pulling her towards something far beyond her understanding. The journey was just beginning, but Clara already knew that she was not the same person she had been when she boarded the train. The world was opening up before her, and with it, the possibilities of who she could become. She didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid. She was ready. The train pushed deeper into the wilderness, carrying its passengers farther from the civilized world they had known. As the days rolled by, Clara's initial excitement remained strong, but now it was layered with a quiet sense of unease. She had embarked on this journey to escape her ordinary life, to experience something thrilling and transformative. Yet, in these moments of solitude, when she found herself lost in the rhythm of the train, the enormity of her decision began to settle in. She was traveling with strangers, deep into the unknown, in a world that could change in an instant. The passengers, most of them aristocrats or scholars, kept mostly to themselves. It wasn't out of malice, but a matter of class. Their conversations at dinner centered on business ventures, upcoming galas, or exhibitions at private galleries, all far removed from Clara's reality. They smiled politely at her, but she could feel the unspoken questions, the lingering glances that asked what someone like her was doing here, among them. Clara tried to brush off the feeling of exclusion. She hadn't come to make friends with these people, after all. She was here for herself. To prove that she could stand shoulder to shoulder with anyone, that she could be bold and adventurous despite the barriers others saw. It was in the quieter hours of the evening, when the jungle outside the train window turned inky black, and the sounds of wildlife echoed through the darkness, that Clara began to feel the tug of uncertainty. She would sit in the observation car, watching the stars appear in the sky, lost in her thoughts. That's where Victor found her again, a few days after their first encounter by the waterfall. He approached with the same calm confidence she remembered. Clara watched him through the reflection in the glass, seeing his figure grow closer before he sat in the seat opposite her. "You come out here often?" he remarked, more as a statement than a question. Clara nodded, glancing at him briefly before returning her gaze to the stars. "It's peaceful. I like the quiet." Victor leaned back in his seat, his eyes softening. "I do too. Out here, away from everything, you start to see things more clearly." Clara felt a tug at his words. She wanted to ask him what he meant, but she wasn't sure she was ready to dive into the kind of conversation his tone suggested. There was something about him that made her feel both at ease and on edge, as though he carried the weight of too many untold stories. She glanced at him again, curiosity winning over her hesitation. "You said you've been on expeditions like this before. What brings you back to the wilderness?" Victor's lips curled into a faint smile, though his eyes remained distant. "The world out here. It's different from everything we know. There are no rules, no expectations. It's raw, unpredictable. I've always felt more at home in places like this." Clara studied him. He spoke with a quiet intensity, and she wondered what kind of life he had lived to prefer the wild over the comforts of society. He didn't seem like the kind of man who needed validation from others or even their company, and yet here he was, sitting with her in the middle of the night, sharing his thoughts. "What about you?" he asked, pulling her out of her contemplation. "Why did you join this expedition? You don't seem like someone who's running away from something. You're chasing something, aren't you?" Clara felt a spark of surprise at his words. How had he seen through her so quickly? Most people barely looked past the surface, content to make assumptions based on what they saw. But Victor seemed to have a way of seeing deeper. She hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "I suppose you could say that. I've spent most of my life in one place. Safe, predictable. But that's not who I want to be. I want more." Victor nodded, as if he understood exactly what she meant. "You're right to chase it. There's more out there than most people ever realize. But the wilderness, it has a way of testing you. It'll push you to your limits." Clara held his gaze, her resolve hardening. "I'm not afraid of that." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. If anything, it felt like an understanding had passed between them, unspoken but clear. They were both searching for something, both driven by a need to step beyond the constraints of their lives. Over the next few days, Clara found herself drawn into conversations with Victor whenever their paths crossed. They rarely spoke in front of the other passengers, but in the quieter moments when the train would stop in a remote area for the group to explore or take in the scenery, they would find each other. Sometimes they would walk in silence, both of them absorbed in the natural beauty around them. Other times they would talk about the places they had been, the dreams they harbored, and the fears they hadn't yet conquered. Victor never spoke much about his past, though. He would mention previous expeditions in passing, but there was a shadow that crossed his face whenever he did. Clara could tell that there was something he wasn't saying, something that weighed heavily on him. She didn't press him. She knew that everyone had their burdens, and that some wounds took longer to heal than others. But the more time she spent with him, the more she realized how much she valued his presence. He was unlike anyone she had ever met, both grounded and mysterious, confident but deeply private. He had an aura about him that made her feel safe, as though no matter what happened, he would know how to handle it. And yet, there was something fragile beneath his surface, something he kept hidden from the world. One afternoon, the group had stopped to explore a set of ancient ruins deep in the jungle. The air was thick with humidity, and the scent of wet earth and leaves filled Clara's lungs. The ruins were magnificent, remnants of a civilization long lost to time. Moss clung to the stone structures, and vines twisted their way through cracks and crevices, nature reclaiming what man had built. Clara wandered through the ruins, marveling at the intricacy of the carvings on the walls, the way the light filtered through the trees and cast dappled shadows on the ground. She was so absorbed in the beauty of the place that she didn't notice Victor approach until he was standing beside her. "It's incredible, isn't it?" he said quietly, his voice reverent as he took in the scene. Clara nodded, unable to find words to describe the awe she felt. Victor glanced at her, a small smile playing on his lips. This is what I love about the wild. It reminds you of how small we are, how fleeting our time is in the grand scheme of things. Clara turned to look at him, surprised by the depth of his words. She had always sensed there was more to Victor than he let on. But this was the first time he had opened up in such a way. "Do you ever feel like you're running out of time?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Victor's smile faded, and for a moment his eyes darkened with something she couldn't quite place. "All the time," he admitted softly. The weight of his words settled between them, and Clara felt a chill despite the heat of the jungle. There was something in his tone, in the way he spoke about time, that made her realize just how much he was carrying. She wanted to ask him more, to understand what had happened to him. But before she could, the expedition leader called for the group to gather. As they made their way back to the train, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Victor's story than he was willing to share. She had come on this journey to discover more about herself, but now she found herself wanting to know more about him too. The wilderness was testing her, as Victor had warned, but it wasn't the terrain or the weather that challenged her. It was the people, the relationships she was forming, the emotions that were stirring inside her, that truly pushed her beyond what she had expected. And somewhere deep inside, she knew that the hardest part of the journey was yet to come. The jungle had a rhythm all its own. Days flowed into nights in a seamless blend of heat, humidity, and the constant hum of life all around them. The deeper the expedition ventured into the heart of the wilderness, the more it felt as though time had lost its meaning. Clara had never felt so alive, so attuned to the world around her. The landscapes they passed through were breathtaking. Tangled vines hanging from towering trees, rivers cutting through lush greenery, and the distant cries of animals that they could never quite spot. But with each passing day, Clara sensed a shift. The skies had darkened, the air grew heavier, and the wildlife, once so vibrant and noisy, seemed to have gone silent. There were hushed conversations among the expedition leaders, their voices tight with concern. Something was coming, something that could test them all. It was Victor who noticed it first. Clara had grown used to his quiet observations, his way of watching the world around him with a kind of knowing that the others didn't possess. He had lived through enough to sense danger before it arrived. That afternoon, as they trekked through the dense jungle, he fell back to walk beside Clara, his expression more serious than usual. "There's a storm coming," he said, his voice low so the others wouldn't hear. Clara glanced at him, the weight of his words sinking in. She could feel it too. The oppressive humidity, the way the wind had started to pick up, and the faint rumble of thunder in the distance. "How bad do you think it'll be?" Victor's eyes scanned the horizon, as though he could see the storm approaching even through the thick canopy of trees. "Bad enough. We need to find shelter soon. This isn't the kind of place you want to be caught out in a storm." His words sent a shiver down Clara's spine. She trusted Victor more than anyone else on the expedition, and if he was worried, she knew they were in real danger. The group pressed on, unaware of the peril that lurked just beyond their sight, their conversations still light-hearted and filled with the excitement of exploration. By the time they reached a narrow mountain pass, the sky had turned an ominous shade of gray, and the first drops of rain began to fall. Clara could feel the tension rising among the group, the expedition leaders exchanging nervous glances as they realized they were running out of time. "We need to move faster," one of the leaders called out, his voice strained. "There's a cave just beyond the ridge. If we can reach it, we'll be safe from the storm." The group quickened their pace, their footsteps growing more frantic as the rain began to fall harder, the wind picking up speed. Clara kept her eyes on Victor, who stayed calm and steady, guiding her through the treacherous terrain with a quiet confidence that made her feel safer than she had any right to in such a situation. But as they neared the ridge, the storm unleashed its full fury. A deafening crack of thunder split the air, and the skies opened up, pouring rain down in sheets so thick it was hard to see more than a few feet ahead. The ground, already slick with moisture, turned to mud beneath their feet, making it nearly impossible to keep their balance. The wind howled through the mountains, tearing at their clothes and whipping the trees into a frenzy. Clara struggled to keep up, her heart pounding in her chest as she fought against the storm. The rain stung her face, and the wind pulled at her with such force that she had to lean into it just to stay upright. She could hear the shouts of the other passengers, but their voices were drowned out by the roar of the storm. Just when she thought they might make it to the cave, disaster struck. A sudden rumble from above made Clara's blood run cold. She looked up just in time to see a boulder dislodge from the side of the mountain, tumbling down toward the path where several members of the group were struggling to make their way across the narrow pass. There was no time to warn them, no time to react. Clara watched in horror as the boulder crashed down, breaking off smaller rocks that scattered like shrapnel in all directions. Screams filled the air, and the group splintered in every direction as they scrambled to avoid the falling debris. Clara stumbled, losing her footing in the chaos. The ground slipped away beneath her feet, and for a terrifying moment, she was falling, her arms flailing as she tried to grasp onto something, anything, to stop her descent. She felt her heart slam against her chest, and panic surged through her, but before she could hit the ground, a strong hand grabbed her arm. Victor. He hauled her up with a strength that defied the storm, his grip steady and sure. His face, streaked with rain and mud, was etched with focus as he pulled her back to her feet, shielding her with his body as more rocks tumbled down around them. "Are you okay?" he shouted over the roar of the storm, his voice barely audible above the chaos. Clara nodded, her throat too tight with fear to speak. She could feel her legs trembling, but Victor didn't let go of her hand, guiding her forward with a determination that gave her the strength to keep moving. The group was scattered now, their desperation palpable as they fought to reach the cave before the storm overwhelmed them completely. Clara and Victor moved as one, pushing through the wind and rain, their eyes fixed on the dim outline of the cave entrance ahead. But the mountain had other plans. Another deafening rumble tore through the air, and Clara looked up just in time to see a massive slab of rock begin to slide down the mountainside. Her heart seized in her chest. It was too big, too fast. There was no way they could outrun it. Before she could react, Victor pulled her to the side, pushing her up against the rocky wall of the pass, just as the boulder came crashing down, inches from where they had been standing moments before. The ground shook beneath them, and Clara could feel the force of the impact reverberate through her bones. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the storm, the rain pounding down and the wind howling through the pass. Clara stood frozen, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She felt Victor's hand on her shoulder, grounding her in the midst of the chaos. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice calm but urgent. "We're almost there." Clara nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat as she followed Victor toward the cave. The rest of the group had already made it inside, their faces pale and drawn as they huddled together for warmth. The cave was shallow, but offered enough protection from the storm for the group to catch their breath and assess the damage. Victor led Clara to a spot near the entrance, his eyes scanning the group to make sure everyone was accounted for. Despite the chaos of the storm, he remained calm, his presence a steadying force amidst the uncertainty. Clara sank to the ground, her body trembling from the adrenaline and fear. The reality of what had just happened slowly sank in. She had been inches from death, and if it hadn't been for Victor's quick reflexes, she might not have made it. She glanced up at him, her chest tightening with gratitude and something else, something deeper. He had saved her life. And not just this time. Time and time again, since the expedition had begun, Victor had been there, quietly guiding her through the wilderness, watching over her in ways she hadn't even realized until now. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the storm raging outside. Victor met her gaze, his expression softening for a moment. He didn't say anything, but his eyes spoke volumes. In that moment, Clara felt a connection between them that went beyond the physical. It was a bond forged in the face of danger, in the raw, untamed wilderness that had tested them both. As the group huddled together in the cave, waiting for the storm to pass, Clara's mind raced with thoughts of what lay ahead. The storm was a reminder that the jungle was unpredictable, dangerous in ways they couldn't always anticipate. But it was also a place where they were discovering their own strength, where Clara was discovering parts of herself she hadn't known existed. And in the eye of the storm, she realized that this journey was about more than just adventure. It was about survival, yes, but it was also about connection. About learning to trust, to rely on others in a way that both terrified and thrilled her. Victor had become more than just a fellow traveler. He was someone she could trust, someone who had already proven that he would risk his own safety to protect her. And as the storm raged on, Clara found herself wondering just how deep that connection would go, and what challenges they would face together as the wilderness continued to test them. The storm had passed, but the journey was far from over, and Clara knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that whatever lay ahead, she wouldn't be facing it alone. The storm had passed, but the world it left behind was irrevocably changed. The jungle, once teeming with vibrant life and noise, was now eerily quiet. The air, thick with moisture, felt heavier than before, as if the earth itself had absorbed the weight of what had just happened. The group, though safely sheltered in the cave, bore the physical and emotional marks of the storm's fury. Clara sat beside Victor, her legs drawn close to her chest as the damp air wrapped around them. The experience had left everyone shaken, but none more than Clara, who kept replaying the moment when Victor had pulled her from the edge of disaster. As the group began to stir, gathering their belongings and discussing their next move, Clara found herself lost in thought. She couldn't stop thinking about Victor's steady hand, his quiet bravery. He had saved her without hesitation, and though she had always known there was something deeper beneath his calm exterior, the storm had revealed just how far he would go to protect those around him. Victor had been unusually quiet since they had escaped the worst of the storm. He moved with purpose, helping the others pack up and tend to those who had been injured in the chaos. But there was a distance in his eyes, a shadow that hadn't been there before. Clara knew he was carrying the weight of the day's events, but she also sensed that something deeper was at play, something from his past that still haunted him. The group decided to press on, eager to put the storm behind them. Though the path ahead was still treacherous, they felt a renewed sense of determination. Clara walked in silence beside Victor, her mind churning with unspoken questions. She wanted to ask him about his past, about the shadows that clung to him even in the brightest moments. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she focused on the rhythmic crunch of her boots against the wet earth, the smell of the rain-soaked jungle filling her lungs. After several hours of trekking through the mud and dense foliage, the group came to a halt at a clearing. The expedition leaders called for a short break, giving everyone a chance to rest and regroup. Clara wandered off to the edge of the clearing, her eyes scanning the horizon. The storm clouds had mostly cleared, but the sky was still overcast, casting a muted light over the landscape. She felt the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on her chest, a mixture of fear and relief that left her feeling strangely unmoored. Victor appeared beside her, silent as ever. They stood together for a moment, watching the jungle stretch out before them. Neither one speaking. Clara finally broke the silence, her voice soft but filled with curiosity. "You've been quiet," she said, turning to look at him. "Is everything okay?" Victor didn't meet her gaze at first. He stood with his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on some distant point in the jungle. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, as if he were speaking more to himself than to her. "I've been through storms like that before, but no matter how many times you face danger out here, it never gets easier." Clara frowned, sensing there was more to his words. She had seen the way he had handled the storm, the way he had kept his composure even in the face of disaster. He was strong, perhaps the strongest person she had ever known. But now, in the quiet aftermath, she could see the cracks in his armor. There was something he wasn't saying, something he had been carrying with him long before this journey began. "You saved me," Clara said, her voice filled with gratitude. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there." Victor finally turned to her. And for the first time since the storm, Clara saw the vulnerability in his eyes. "You would have made it," he said, but his voice lacked the conviction she was used to hearing. "You're stronger than you think, Clara." His words touched her, but they also left her with more questions. She stepped closer to him, her brow furrowed with concern. "You've been through this before, haven't you? You know what it's like to face something like that and come out the other side." Victor's jaw tightened, and he glanced away, the shadow in his eyes growing darker. Clara could see that he was struggling, that whatever haunted him was clawing at the surface. She reached out, gently placing a hand on his arm. "You don't have to carry it alone, you know." For a moment, Clara thought he might pull away, retreating back into the silence that had become his shield. But then, to her surprise, Victor let out a breath he had been holding for far too long. He turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and resignation. "I lost someone," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "On an expedition, years ago. We were caught in a storm not unlike this one, but I couldn't save her." Clara's heart sank. She had suspected that there was a painful history buried beneath Victor's stoic exterior, but hearing him say the words brought a new level of understanding. She could see the weight of his guilt. The way it had shaped him, made him more guarded, more distant. "I'm so sorry," she said softly, her hand still resting on his arm. "That must have been unbearable." Victor nodded, his gaze fixed on the ground. "It was. I couldn't forgive myself. I told myself I would never let that happen again. That's why I came back, to prove that I could do it right this time, to make up for my failure." Clara felt a surge of emotion, a deep sympathy for the man standing in front of her. He had carried this burden alone for so long, punishing himself for something that had been beyond his control. She stepped closer, her voice gentle but firm. "Victor, you can't keep blaming yourself. What happened, it wasn't your fault." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and sorrow. "It doesn't change the fact that she's gone, that I couldn't save her." Clara shook her head, her heart aching for him. "No, it doesn't. But you can't keep living in the past. You've saved people. Today, you saved me. That means something." Victor's expression softened, and for a moment, Clara thought she saw a flicker of hope in his eyes. He nodded slowly, as if her words were starting to sink in. But she knew that healing from something like this wouldn't happen overnight. It would take time, and it would take more than just words. The group began to stir again, preparing to move forward, but Clara and Victor remained where they were, standing at the edge of the clearing. The air between them was thick with unspoken understanding, the bond that had been forming since the beginning of the expedition, now solidified by the vulnerability they had just shared. "I'm glad you're here," Clara said quietly, her eyes locked on his. "I wouldn't want to be on this journey with anyone else." Victor gave her a small, tired smile. "I'm glad you're here too, Clara. You've been stronger than you realize." As the group resumed their trek, Clara and Victor walked side by side, their steps in sync as they navigated the rough terrain. The jungle, though still daunting, no longer felt as overwhelming as it had before. Clara knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she wasn't facing them alone. She had Victor, and now she understood that he, too, needed her. The days that followed brought more challenges. The jungle tested their limits, physically and emotionally, but with each passing day, Clara felt herself growing stronger. She wasn't the same woman who had boarded the train at the start of the expedition. She was tougher now, more resilient, and she had found a sense of purpose that she had never known before. Victor, too, seemed lighter. The shadow that had haunted him was still there, but it no longer dominated his every thought. He smiled more, laughed with the group, and his eyes no longer carried the same weight of regret. Clara knew that he was still healing, but she also knew that he had taken a step forward, away from the past and toward a future that was still unwritten. One evening, as the sun set over the jungle, casting the world in hues of orange and pink, Clara sat with Victor at the edge of the camp. They watched the sky darken, the stars slowly emerging one by one. The silence between them was comfortable, a shared peace that didn't need words. "Thank you," Victor said softly, breaking the silence. Clara glanced at him, surprised. "For what?" "For reminding me that it's okay to let go," he replied, his eyes reflecting the fading light. "For helping me see that I'm not alone." Clara smiled, her heart swelling with warmth. We all need a little help sometimes. You've helped me more than you know." Victor didn't say anything more, but the look in his eyes told Clara everything she needed to know. They had both been on separate journeys when they first met, but now their paths had intertwined in ways neither of them could have predicted. And though they didn't know what the future held, they were facing it together. As the stars blinked into existence above them, Clara felt a quiet sense of certainty settle over her. The journey had changed her in ways she hadn't expected, but it had also given her something she hadn't known she was searching for: a connection, a purpose, and a newfound courage that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. The days following the storm had a sense of clarity about them, as though the storm had not only swept through the jungle, but through the hearts of those who had faced it. The landscape was calmer now, the dense canopy of trees filtering the sunlight into golden beams that danced across the forest floor. Yet, there was still an undercurrent of tension, an awareness that the jungle, beautiful as it was, remained untamed and dangerous. The group had made progress slowly but steadily, and the end of their expedition was in sight. Clara could feel it in the way the air seemed to change, growing less oppressive with each passing mile. The conversations among the group had shifted too, no longer just about the adventure itself, but about what they would do once they returned to their old lives. Some spoke of returning to grand estates and important gatherings, while others talked of publishing their stories or contributing to scientific journals. But for Clara, the thought of returning to her previous life felt surreal. The woman who had left that small town, eager for adventure, was not the same woman who now walked through the jungle with a sense of purpose and conviction. Victor had changed too. Though he still carried the quiet intensity that had drawn her to him from the start, there was a lightness in his step that hadn't been there before. The weight of his past seemed less visible now, as though the jungle had not only tested them physically, but had given them both the space to heal. And though they didn't talk about it, Clara knew that whatever bond had formed between them during this journey would stay with them long after the expedition ended. The final leg of their journey took them to a mountain pass, a breathtakingly beautiful but perilous route that offered the group their first real glimpse of the world beyond the jungle. The mountain loomed ahead of them, its peaks jagged against the sky, the path winding upward through narrow, rocky trails. The expedition leaders cautioned the group to move carefully, as the terrain could be treacherous, especially after the recent rains. But there was an excitement in the air, a sense that the hardest part of the journey was behind them, and now they were on the verge of something extraordinary. Clara walked beside Victor as they ascended the trail, the wind tugging at their clothes and the air growing thinner as they climbed higher. The view was unlike anything Clara had ever seen. Below them, the jungle stretched out in an endless sea of green, and above the sky was a clear, brilliant blue. For a moment, she felt as though she were standing on the edge of the world, caught between two vast, untamed forces of nature. "This is incredible," Clara whispered, her voice filled with awe. Victor, standing beside her, nodded but said nothing. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, a look of quiet contemplation on his face. Clara had grown used to his silences by now, understanding that there were moments when words were unnecessary. They had shared so much in the past few days, both spoken and unspoken, that there was a deep comfort in simply being together, in knowing that they didn't need to fill every moment with conversation. The group pressed on, moving carefully along the narrow path that wound up the side of the mountain. The higher they climbed, the more precarious the trail became, the rocks loose underfoot and the edges sharp. The wind had picked up too, gusting in unpredictable bursts that made it difficult to keep their balance. It was then, in a moment of terrible clarity, that disaster struck. Clara had been focused on her footing, carefully navigating a particularly steep section of the trail, when she heard the sound. A low rumble, like the growl of an angry beast, echoed through the mountains. At first it seemed distant, but then it grew louder, more insistent, and Clara's heart seized in her chest as she realized what was happening. A rock slide. She looked up just in time to see a section of the mountainside give way, a cascade of boulders and loose earth tumbling down toward the trail. Panic erupted in the group, shouts of alarm cutting through the air as the rocks came crashing down with terrifying speed. Clara's instincts kicked in, and she scrambled to move out of the way. But the path was too narrow, the rocks too fast. Before she could even process what was happening, she felt a hand grab her arm, yanking her to the side just as a boulder the size of a carriage crashed down where she had been standing. It was Victor. He had pulled her into the small alcove carved into the side of the mountain, shielding her with his body as the rocks tumbled past. For a moment, everything was chaos. The sound of the rocks, the shouts of the group, the wind howling through the pass. It all blended together in a cacophony that seemed to swallow them whole. But then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the rock slide stopped. The mountain was still again, the only sound the ragged breathing of those who had survived. Clara's heart was racing, her entire body trembling as the adrenaline coursed through her veins. She turned to Victor, her chest tight with fear and relief. "Are you okay?" she managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. Victor nodded, but Clara could see the strain in his eyes. His breathing was labored, and he winced as he shifted his weight. She glanced down and saw that his leg had been caught by a smaller rock, pinning him in place. Panic flared in her chest as she realized the extent of his injury. "We need to get you out of here," she said urgently, trying to move the rock, but it was too heavy for her to lift on her own. Victor shook his head, his face pale but determined. "You need to keep going, Clara. The group needs you." Clara's heart clenched at his words. "I'm not leaving you here," she said fiercely. "We'll get through this together, like we always have." But Victor's eyes softened, and he reached out to take her hand, his grip surprisingly strong despite the pain he was in. "You've come so far, Clara," he said quietly. "You've become everything you were meant to be. Strong, fearless, and capable of anything. Don't let this stop you. Keep moving forward." Tears pricked at Clara's eyes, and she shook her head, unwilling to accept what he was saying. "You saved me, Victor. You've always been there for me. I can't." Her voice broke, and she swallowed hard, trying to hold back the flood of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. Victor's expression softened, and for the first time since they had met, Clara saw the vulnerability in his eyes. "You don't need me to protect you anymore," he said gently. "You're stronger than you know, Clara. You always have been." Clara's chest tightened with emotion, but before she could respond, the expedition leader approached with the rest of the group. They quickly assessed the situation and, with the help of several others, managed to free Victor's leg from beneath the rock. But the injury was severe, and though he tried to hide it, Clara could see the pain etched into his face. They fashioned a makeshift stretcher for Victor, and as they carried him down the mountain, Clara stayed by his side, her hand clasped tightly in his. She couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness that gnawed at her. She had always seen Victor as unbreakable. But now, as she watched him struggle to stay conscious, she realized that even the strongest among them had their limits. By the time they reached the base of the mountain, Victor was barely awake, his breaths shallow and uneven. The group had radioed for help and a rescue team was on its way, but Clara knew they were running out of time. She knelt beside him, her heart aching with every labored breath he took. "I'm sorry," Victor whispered, his voice barely audible. Clara shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "Don't you dare apologize," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "You've done everything, Victor. You've given everything." He managed a faint smile, his eyes meeting hers. "Promise me you'll keep going, Clara. Don't stop." Clara nodded through her tears, her heart breaking as she took his hand in hers. "I promise," she whispered. And then with a final, shaky breath, Victor closed his eyes. The days that followed felt like a blur. Clara returned with the group, but her heart remained behind, on that mountain with Victor. The rescue team had arrived too late, and though the rest of the group made it back safely, Clara knew that she would never be the same. Victor had changed her life in ways she couldn't fully understand. He had shown her a world beyond the one she had known, a world of courage, of resilience, and of love. And though he was gone, his memory stayed with her, a constant reminder of the strength she had found within herself. In the years that followed, Clara continued to travel, to explore the world, just as she and Victor had dreamed. She visited the places he had spoken of, saw the wonders of the world through the lens of the person she had become. And every time she faced a challenge, every time she felt the weight of the world pressing down on her, she thought of Victor and the promise she had made. He had given her the courage to live fully, and that was exactly what she intended to do. Clara's story didn't end with the expedition, but it was forever shaped by it. She carried Victor's memory with her in every step, knowing that his love and sacrifice had made her the woman she was always meant to be. And in the quiet moments, when the world slowed down and the noise faded away, Clara would close her eyes and feel the presence of the man who had saved her life in more ways than one. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.